Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Team Enough and March for Lives DC Youth Lobbying Collective. Thank you so much for hopping on your webinar today. We really appreciate you all coming on to learn about these important issues. Our collective's purpose is to educate youth activists and train them with a very comprehensive understanding of gun violence and its policy-based solutions in order to empower them to lobby federal lawmakers. We have two more collectives based in Northern California and Tallahassee, Florida. If anyone on this call is from either the DMV area, NorCal, or Tallahassee and would like to get involved with webinars, feel free to shoot me an email after this webinar is over and I'll connect you with the leads in each of those areas. So our webinar today is based on faith-based approaches to gun violence prevention, and we have two amazing speakers with us, Venerable Children and Pastor Michael McBride. If both of you would like to go ahead and introduce themselves.
Well, my name is Michael McBride. I am a pastor of a Pentecostal church in the Bay Area, Berkeley to be exact. I also lead the national campaign of the Faith in Action Network that is called Live Free. This is our gun violence prevention campaign, our decarceration in ending mass incarceration campaign, and our campaign to address the issues of access to both the vote and opportunity for those caught in cycles of violence and incarceration. Very glad to be here hanging out with you all, and look forward to the knowledge transfer that we will share one with another.
Okay, so my name's Thupten Chodron. I'm a Buddhist nun, the abbess of Sravasti Abbey up in Washington State. I don't have a long list of credentials or things, but I do prison work, with people who are incarcerated. And then, of course, teaching Buddhist meditation and psychology and philosophy a lot, nationally and internationally.
Thank you so much for introducing yourselves. Tika, if you'd like to get us started.
Yeah. So I guess we can just start off with a very simple question, I guess. Not simple, it's rather complex, but a great way to just get us started off. So can you guys both, in each of your respective religions, tell us how gun violence can be a religious issue? And feel free to take that as you will.
Pastor, would you like to begin?
No, please, go ahead.
Oh, okay. To me personally, I don't think gun violence is a religious issue. I think it's an ethical issue. And of course, ethics and morality fit a lot into religion. But for me, it's ethical, and so it goes beyond an individual religion. It goes to all living beings, and what is ethical for everybody, regardless of your religious bent.
Well, I would agree that certainly, gun violence is not, at the heart of religion per se, but as she has rightly, stated, this is about, the way we live out, the way we live out our highest ideals, our highest principles, those things that we would hopefully imagine to be that which is beyond us, right? And so to the extent that gun violence fractures or interrupts, or dare I say, and we say, steal the humanity of that which we have been called at our highest level to steward, to care for, to value, to hold with tenderness and precious care, gun violence then becomes an issue that transcends religion per se, and is really at the heart of what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be someone that is worthy of that which you call to be righteous, holy, et cetera, et cetera. And so particularly as a Christian, as a follower of the ways of Jesus, it is a religious issue as it pertains to my or our ability or inability to be the source, a source of life, a source of healing, a source of hope, a source of unity. And so in that way, I believe it becomes a religious issue as a way of us being faithful to the teachings of the one we call Jesus the Christ.
Yeah. Yeah, for us too, it involves being faithful to the teachings. But I don't see it as something that involves worship so much.
Yeah, and you know, unfortunately, in this country, it does involve worship because many have made the gun out to be an idol. And so,
yes.
You know, the Christian preacher, I have no problem telling many of my Christian counterparts or so-called Christians or whoever that when the gun becomes something that you can't live without, then maybe it has become an idol. It has become an object of your worship. And thereby you may have to do, as the scriptures say, your first works over again.
Yeah. Can you get through to those people who really idolize the gun like that and see it as part of who they are and their rights and their religion? Do you have a way to really get through to them so that they understand what you're saying?
Well, I think that it depends, right? For some who are mostly masking their fear with religious kind of icing on the cake. You know, the key is to get to the root cause, which is fear of other, fear of a constructed boogeyman. It is fear of people who are not like them. It is a fear of retribution, retaliation for sins of the past. And so I think, addressing the fear of both the perpetrator and even at times victims of violence helps then to unlock a kind of deep love that hopefully overrides their fear, thus kind of minimizing this idol that we have created. The idol that is really at the end of the day about power and domination, not service and love.
Yeah, right. But I imagine you can't start that off with, I'm here to tell you to abandon your guns and now we're going to get to the root issues. It seems to me you probably have to leave the issue of guns on the back burner and talk to them about what it is they're afraid of. And then through that, then bring in the issue of guns.
Yeah, I guess it all depends, right, on what the purpose or what the pathway to the result that we're seeking. I'm also trained as a therapist and a drug and alcohol counselor, and so we use harm reduction models. And so I don't think that I can get much of. I've not been able to get anyone, much less a very conservative gun owner, to go from 0 to 60 overnight. I think that incrementalism is probably the best that we can get.
Yes.
Often, I do believe that if we can build a relational connection, sometimes that starts with our faith, shared faith. Sometimes that starts with our shared culture. Sometimes it starts with a shared pain. Sometimes it starts with a shared story or narrative. And then begin to walk people from where they are, really taking seriously, this is where they are, where we want them to be. It may create some shared opportunities for even the religion, quote unquote, or the faith to be a vehicle for people to move away from the gun and to something that's a lot less destructive.
Right. I completely agree with you there that it's a thing of making a human connection with these people. Because if you come on and it's just about politics and it's just about you believe this and you're wrong, I mean, people are just going to tune you out. That's it. But if you can make a human connection, we're all living beings we all want to be happy. None of us want to suffer. We all want to be safe. And if we can develop an ability to listen to their concerns, yeah, because like you say, I think a lot of it really, fear lies behind the attachment to guns. And if we could, open up a dialogue that is very far away from politics and policy and is just a human dialogue, I think that's the way to have the most kind of effect on people that will be a long-lasting effect.
So a very good point that you brought up. I think it's definitely would be useful to discuss this issue in a more human way if we just kind of made like a personal connection with people we're trying to like get this point across to. I think that might help us further develop this conversation.
Yeah.
So, Tika, if you could move on to the next slide. So we know that gun violence has a tendency to uniquely impact a lot of minority communities, such as like the Jewish community, for example. There's a lot of anti-Semitism feelings running around this nation. So what we were wondering was, how does gun violence uniquely impact both the Buddhist and the Christian communities?
Your turn.
Well, obviously, I often ask, which Christian community are you talking about? Because, it's worth saying and lifting up that, there have been multiple forms or kinds or gatherings of Christian communities, at the very least since its, inception. And particularly in this country, I think there's always been a settler colonial version of Christianity that's been deeply, deeply overdetermined by human hierarchy, white supremacy, imperialism, and the necessity of the gun for these kinds of Christians, I think, continue to be, the uniqueness of white evangelicalism. But I think that there are other forms of Christian expression, the Quakers, many forms that do not require or depend upon the use of violence and or the use of weapons. As a Pentecostal, Black Pentecostal holiness pastor, my tradition was a tradition in its earliest inception in the early 20th century that was a pacifist tradition. That some of our earliest texts declare that we could not shed blood. Now, most people don't know that because, growing up as a Black Southern religious or Christian person in the South during the height of the Ku Klux Klan, many folks, had to own guns in order to protect their families. So then guns were really about self-defense in a Black Christian experience. Now, it's very obvious that, of course, the presence of guns in our communities across all socially constructed categories is tantamount to you owning a nuclear bomb in your home. It is rife for nothing but death and destruction to all who touch it. Even the intent of it being there as a form of self-defense, all the research tells us that you are more likely to shoot yourself, or someone in your family is more likely to be harmed by the presence of that weapon, that personal nuclear bomb. And so I think it's really important for all of us to continue to keep reminding ourselves that the uniqueness of the presence of guns and weapons in our communities, no matter what kind of moral, religious, and or pragmatic reason we say we need them or they impact us, is really one of deception. It is a false deception, a false sense of safety. In my experience, I've done more funerals for children who've been killed by guns than any other, reason for their death. And so as a Christian, as someone who's had to do dozens of Christian funerals for young people and their families who've been killed. Gun violence is something that tears away at our shared humanity. It unleashes trauma that is cross-generational, and it continues to foster a certain level of fear, anguish, and retaliation that really strains our ability as followers of Jesus to live into the command to love our enemies, to forgive those who harm us, and to believe that resurrection is stronger than the forces of death. I could say more, but I'll stop there.
Yeah, how has it uniquely impacted the Buddhist community? I don't really know. The Buddhist community is known, or Buddhism in general is known as a very pacifistic faith. And so most people regard us in that way. We haven't experienced a lot of violence towards us, although that's certainly not impossible. I know some years ago, there was one Thai temple that somebody came in and shot up. But I don't hear of so many attacks against the Buddhist community. And in terms of Buddhists owning guns, our faith is really so much predicated on nonviolence. I mean, that's just a real basic tenet. So I don't think a lot of Buddhists have guns, or if the people that at least come to our place have guns, they don't mention it to me, because I think they know very well what I would say, because I speak about this kind of thing. But I completely agree with you that gun ownership is very much based on fear. Our Abbey is located in a very conservative part of Eastern Washington State, and the redoubters are very near us. So the people who like guns and see guns as a part of who they are as Americans, which I completely agree with you, comes from probably, pre-Civil War, that the white man needed the guns to control the slaves and the Indians. So those, I know there's a question that's going to follow about, does gun violence have to do with white supremacy? And I would say, you bet it does. It's very much involved with that. And I don't think that issue has been brought out in the press enough. I don't think enough people really consider that. For example, I know I'm getting a little bit off the track here, but the demonstrations against the shutdown, like in Michigan, the very angry people who come to the Capitol with their arms to, saying, give me freedom or give me death, and, let's get rid of the shelter at home rules. I see in that a very much a white supremacist, dig in my heels, this is my Second Amendment right feeling, that I wonder how much it really has to do with the shelter at home instruction, and how much it has to do with angry people wanting to make a statement. And why are they angry? Well, the fear that you mentioned, I think is a big factor in it.
Thank you. I love how you guys really kind of feed off of each other. It's really, really just a great thing to watch. So I think you touched on this a little bit. You touched on a little bit about like the certain values that each respective religions preach with regards to perpetuating nonviolence. So I was hoping you both could go into a little bit more in depth about what specifically what in the, I don't want to say this on Pataka, or the Bible perpetuates the non-violence.
Okay.
Oh.
Okay, I'll go first on this one. I guess we'll take turns, Pastor Mike.
That's good.
So, as I mentioned, nonviolence is a very core Buddhist tenet. And when we talk about the precepts that Buddhists take, the first one is not to kill. And that means not to kill. It doesn't mean don't kill all the people that you care about, but you can kill other people. Or don't kill the people you agree with, but you can kill the people you disagree with. It means completely across the board, not killing. And this is something that is very important, that we come across at the beginning when we come into Buddhist teachings. It's right there, and especially in terms of human beings, because we see human life as having human beings as having an exceptional potential that other forms of life, like animals, don't really have. And so having human intelligence, which can be used for good or can be used for bad, having human intelligence is to be respected and then used properly. And so taking a human life is really totally against what we believe, and also taking animal life. Now, having said that, that doesn't mean that all Buddhists are vegetarians, because there's different ways in different countries and different Buddhist traditions of practicing this. And the Rohingya situation, I get asked about that a lot. And to tell you the truth, I cannot in any way understand those Buddhist monks who are roughing everybody up and causing so much suffering to the Rohingya population in Myanmar. I don't understand it at all. From a Buddhist viewpoint. From a human viewpoint, you don't like a certain group. Yeah. But from a Buddhist viewpoint, what they're doing is totally, unacceptable in our ethical guidelines.
Yeah, I think it's really important to nuance and keep nuancing, the faith of both Christians and Jews and Muslims and Buddhists and all across, these great religions, because I think in each one of our teachings, the greatest that our traditions have to offer humanity are these ideas of universal love, justice, peace, etc. Within the Bible, the quote unquote, Jewish Christian Bible, depending on how you think about that, you will find, if read from a very fundamentalist point of view, people will take the descriptions of both Israel's response to God as revealed to them as these kinds of commands to kill, rather than, as some of us would like to suggest, are a living, breathing self-discovery of the Jews or Israel coming into a sense of faithfulness of what does it mean to actually steward creation. And so I think that it's really important for, myself as a Christian to take the life of Jesus most seriously as I attempt to make sense of what do the scriptures, the text of the Christian tradition attempt to teach us. If Jesus, by Jesus' own self-description, is described as the Prince of Peace, described as someone who tells Peter at the most vulnerable moment of Jesus' life to put your sword away, for those who live by the sword will die by the sword. If Jesus says to his disciples, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for you shall be called the children of God." And over again, Jesus rejects the use of violence to usher in or to signal the dawning of his new kingdom, if you will. Then I think that it's very, very important for us then as followers of Jesus to attempt to interpret and, dare I say, reinterpret the Bible through that lens. And so the Bible, unfortunately can be used as a fundamentalist weapon to make sense of all kinds of atrocities. But the expression or the life of Jesus is very hard to manipulate in that regard. It's harder to make Jesus a gun-toting, imperialist, because those kind of folk rarely end up on the cross. Those folk usually, use the weapons of war to secure power, not end up on the actual, instrument of death for the empire, right? And so, I think this is one of the most important parts of what it means for we who are organizers and we who are attempting to help educate and bring, the Christians, quote unquote, who can be brought along in this way. Many of them have just learned the faith wrong. They've been discipled in a very incorrect manner. And so one of the things we attempt to do is, give each one of these folks who claim to follow Jesus an assignment to search for all of the scriptures in the text that call for peace, that call for, reconciliation, that call for, surrendering one's life, that call for a turning of the other cheek, that call for the inverting of the power relationships in favor of the poor, the vulnerable, the least, the lost, and the left out. And you will find that the more people become familiar with these passages of scripture, the harder then it becomes for them to maintain a commitment to an imperial religion that some would like to call Christianity, but is actually more just a fundamentalism with the name Christian attached to it. And so we think it's really a process of discipleship, to use a word we use in our formation, perhaps is a more universal word, a way to form people well after the parts of the text that reinforce the life of the one whom we follow, rather than attempting to reinscribe bits and pieces of the whole of the text that really are a reinforcement of our own, perhaps, worse selves in many respects.
Yeah, maybe the Christians, because of certain passages in the Bible, have a harder time with this, because you have to explain that and go against, tell people how to interpret those passages that literally sound like violence. In Buddhism, we don't have those passages in our scriptures. If anything, we see wars, certain factions, wanting to fight, and the Buddha coming and interceding and breaking it up before war breaks out. So those are the kinds of stories we have in our scriptures. So I think in that way, it makes it maybe a little bit easier for us.
Just going off a little bit about what you both just said about the values in both of your scriptures, has there ever been like a time where religion has been used as like a means to instrumentalize violence, or has it ever been used as a target of violence?
Oh, good. I majored in history in college, and oh my goodness, every generation they're killing each other in Europe in the name of God. And that's what made me lose I rejected religion at that point, because I thought if it's just used to kill people, especially, you're killing people in the name of God. It's like, we don't need that. So, yeah, I think religion has often been used to incite violence, um, produce violence, continue violence. And we see it nowadays in what's going on too. Yeah, very much. And that makes me very sad, because religion is supposed to be for human betterment, and it's co-opted so often into us and them, and we have the one right way and you don't have the correct faith, and so we're going to convert you by threatening you, basically. To me, that really goes against the purpose of religion. And I think very often religious followers, if I could speak for Jesus, I think Jesus would be totally horrified nowadays to see what people say and do in his name, because he, as you said, he definitely was not a warmonger. He was a peacemaker.
Yeah, this is again why I think it's really important for us to try to use language to nuance these conversations, because I think fundamentalism is likely the truest culprit of those religious kind of sensibilities that are easily taken over by violence. I think it's really important for us to remind ourselves that if we take the teachings of our traditions very seriously, they don't lead us down a pathway to violence. Other things do, other impulses do, right? And so those impulses are easily, left by most human beings in the dark, quote unquote, and that which is easily left for us to grasp, whether it is religion, culture, economics, all these categories, they can become a catalyst for our worst selves. So I definitely believe that the history of religious fundamentalism that has given us far too many slippery slopes, far too many, logs on the fire of some of our fears and anxieties and greed, if you will. That is what we must prayerfully call out and form people better in ways that surface those values of our traditions that actually are about the care and the sustaining and the flourishing of all creation.
Yeah.
And I think that those things are just as present in all of our texts as possible, even those texts in the scriptures that attribute violence to the Most High, to the Almighty. I think you can find ways through a more faithful application, interpretation, to even unearth that in and of itself is what God is actually calling us away from and not calling us to carry out. And so it's a project. It's a lifelong project, as you stated. For some reason, human beings have a tendency to allow our animalistic residue come to the surface. I think our intelligence would attribute it to something else, but the power of faith, the power of being rightly formed, hopefully tames those voices, those urges, those impulses, those fears, and then brings us into a shared humanity that I think is within the grasp of most people in the world, particularly even those we may be politically at odds with in this country. I think there's a kernel of truth of this interconnectedness that is just buried under lots and lots of patriotism and xenophobia, homophobia, all these things. Prayerfully, the faith can be the bleach, if you will, or the nice cool water that can wipe and wash away all of that But in the meantime, I think we should call out the fundamentalism that tends to be at the root of all of these kind of religious expressions of violence and domination.
Yeah.
Thank you. I love that's such an interesting topic you bring up, how there's always the common causes that each religion can kind of agree upon, that there is, something we all can do about gun violence. So to kind of go into a little bit more specifics, specifically you, Venerable Chaudhry, is that correct how you say it?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So what are the I think you went into this a little bit, but like as to the practical applications of Buddhism teachings and how we use it to prevent gun violence, we're also hoping you could go into more depth about how you, being the founder of your organization, of your Buddhist ashram, I believe is what it's called?
Abbey.
Abbey.
Monastery.
So all that you've learned in doing that and all the work you've done in the prison system, how has that shaped your view about gun violence? It's a loaded question, so please take your time.
Okay, so you're asking me personally how my life experiences have shaped my view on gun violence?
Yes.
Okay. I think that starts out actually before I became a Buddhist. I was raised Jewish and born in 1950 in the shadow of the Holocaust. And, just by that, it had a very strong effect on me growing up in a minority religion that was, for centuries, the object of attack and discrimination. So my awareness of violence and antipathy towards violence started way back then, before I even knew Buddhism. And so I think, a lot of the conditioning I received as a child in that way really, in some way, led me towards becoming a Buddhist. Yeah, because I didn't really find, Buddhism's statements and feeling about nonviolence is so strong that really, that felt totally unhypocritical to me. Yeah. Whereas I can understand what is going on in Israel. I can understand how the Holocaust is alive and well all these years later in Israel, and how that impacts the Israeli political situation. But I certainly cannot agree with the violence towards the Palestinians and the oppression of the Palestinians. To me, that goes completely against what I learned as a Jewish child. So I don't know how much you asked for my personal experience. I gave that, okay? Yeah.
Move on. Simran?
Yeah, so Pastor McBride, I know you're the director of the Live Free campaign. Just to provide a little more context for our audience here, from what I understand, the Live Free campaign is basically led by hundreds of faith organizations throughout the United States, and you're basically committed to ending gun violence and mass incarceration of young people of color. So I was just wondering how your work in that role has shaped your view of gun violence.
Yeah, well, I think for many of us, our efforts really were birthed out of Christian Catholic clergy, faith leaders who were overwhelmed by the bearing of children, of teenagers in cities like Oakland, Detroit, Camden, New Jersey. We all realized that one of the things we had in common were that we were bearing lots of Black, young people, particularly young men, at a rate that was really giving us all a crisis of faith. And so for us, we said, what would it look like for us rather than continuing to pray for a miracle. We became the answer to our own prayers. And so we began to do a lot of research around the kinds of strategies that were peacemaking at their core, that did not result in the increased incarceration of our loved ones. We did some research around some of those strategies that used religious congregations as a source and a hub for both peacemaking and healing work. And we began to scale that process up across the country. In 2010, we gathered about 100 or so individuals from across the country in Oakland to have a kickoff meeting. We subsequently went on a 10-city tour and began to train folks in cities that included Kansas City, Missouri, Camden, New Jersey, Baton Rouge, Louisiana, Detroit, Michigan, Dallas, Texas, Oakland, Los Angeles, Philadelphia, New York, Boston, and we started to train folks on some of the best practices that we were able to learn, and those practices required a radical rethinking by cities, police departments, and even federal government officials on how to redefine victims and perpetrators. We realized that many of the perpetrators, quote unquote, of violence were often at one point in their life first victims. But because most people only came into contact with Black youth or poor Latino youth after they had done something terrible, their whole life was never afforded them an opportunity to be treated as a victim. So even though they themselves had been shot or harmed or accosted in their physical body, they were never given an opportunity to heal, never given an opportunity for safety and protection. And so they themselves perpetuated or repeated the very violence that had happened to them. And so gun violence for us has become then the greatest expression of our failed human relationship to one another. But it has also expanded our understanding about the role of policing. We have come to continue to assert and believe that police shootings is indeed just as egregious, if not much more so, than the shootings between civilians, because of the levels of impact these shootings have on the ability for our communities to feel protected and safe from forces that are both seen and unseen. So we hope that our work, it has, and it definitely has. When we first started in 2009 or 10, we were told by the Obama administration that guns was not on their agenda, and it was the third rail of politics, and they would never take it up. And by the second term, we were able to be one of many groups in the country that really challenged and pushed the Obama administration to be much more public in their commitment to address issues of gun violence. Of course, the shooting and the massacre at Newtown was a catalyst for that. But I was part of conversations in the White House with Vice President Biden and others who were still very squeamish about even speaking about urban gun violence, because as they told me, they did not want to lose the country. And so we had to do a lot of that heavy lifting, but thankfully today, the success of our collective work even now sees gun violence interrupters in urban communities across the country. They are now being described as essential workers. And so peacemaking is now seen in many cities across the country as essential work, when 10 years ago, many folks were not even regarding these kinds of strategies as successful, much less essential. So it's been a important 10 years of work, but we still have much work to go.
Yeah, I can imagine that working with the police department, I really wonder what that is like, because I think of now that we have an armed citizenry, that's going to make the police much more afraid and much more ready to shoot. Whereas in previous years when guns were not so prevalent, perhaps the police violence also wasn't as prevalent. I don't know. I don't have statistics on that. What do you think?
Yeah, well, the history of policing in this country started as slave patrols.
Yes.
Not necessarily the presence of violent armed citizens that fueled the rise of policing. Often they were at their very core attempting to control the public movements of the other, right? And at various different times in the history of this country, the other was not just black or brown. There was a time when the other was considered Jews, or the other was considered Polish, or the other was considered Irish or Italian. Yeah. And so police departments at their root have always been about social controls. Now, I think it's really important to just keep appreciating that at the turn of the civil rights era, we started to see the racialization of violence at the hands of the police, particularly because of the ways in which, the consolidation of whiteness was beginning to become institutionalized vis-a-vis policy. And so, we who live here in Oakland are very familiar with the migration patterns of Black Southerners who largely fled the South because of the Ku Klux Klan, who in many respects were police officers. And so there were many Black Oaklanders who fled Mississippi, who fled Texas, who fled Louisiana, who fled Arkansas and came to California. And they were fleeing the violence of the Ku Klux Klan. Cities like Oakland and others then recruited police officers from the South and brought them to our cities to continue to keep the Black community, contained. And so I think that, it is one of these kinds of, retelling of history that is often much more charitable to police officers than it is to the reality that police violence towards Black or communities that are considered the other has been persistent from the of policing. It is certainly, I think a reality that, armed citizens definitely heighten the kinds of anxiety of police officers. But I think it's always important to appreciate that the disproportionate number of citizens shot by police officers who are unarmed are always Black and brown. That there is a certain kind of psyche around the criminalization of Blackness. Khalil Gibran Muhammad has a wonderful book that all should read called The Condemnation of Blackness that really helps to unearth this. And I think it would serve us well, particularly in the gun violence field, to just appreciate that the darker your skin is, the more your body is prone to die in this country due to guns at the hands of police or at the hands of another person. And it is very important then for us to start asking different questions about what kind of re-socialization does our national consciousness need in order to ensure that we are not perpetuating this Black death and the death of others disproportionately. When we talk about suicides, we certainly know that the disproportionate impact the suicides have on white young men, and that that kind of hopelessness, that kind of isolation and despair that literally is driving so many of our young white men and older men to kill themselves using guns. These are all parts of the underbelly of the failure of this, social experiment. And so we must, not attribute it to the gun and attribute it, as we've been saying, I think from the inception of this, that hole in the heart of the human, that lack of formation that causes us to fall into fear and anger and pain and not healing love and hope.
Yeah.
So I think we're actually gonna go to our last question because you guys kind of covered that. Just to kind of wrap it up, you guys did talk in actually throughout the entire webinar. You talked about how different religions can find common ground when trying to attack issues of gun violence. I was just hoping if you guys think of any other ways that we can all approach it from a religious perspective, what other ideas you both have, just a final thought on the topic, if you will.
And just to add on to that, just as another way to look at the question, how exactly can religion be used as a basis to promote peace building and reduce the threat of violence in our communities?
If this is the last question, then I don't know how much what I want to say pertains to the question or not, maybe a little bit, but something I think that Buddhism has, that since this is a webinar for young activists, that I would like to propose, because I think when you do activist work, it's very, very important to have a spiritual foundation, because without that spiritual foundation, then it's so easy to become like the people that you were protesting against, and it's so easy to say, oh, all those people, they are all like this, and they're bad, and they're full of fear, and and it's the people, Whereas from a Buddhist perspective, we always separate, or we teach to separate the action from the human being. So human beings may do horrible actions motivated by their anger, their pain, their fear, their resentment, but that doesn't mean that the person is bad. Okay? So I think this is something really important in our country at this time, because we put people into groups as persons and then become very judgmental against them. Whereas actually it's the actions that are the problem, not the people. From a Buddhist viewpoint, we say everybody has the Buddha nature. In Christianity, maybe you would say that as everybody is Christ-like. I don't know. But we would say everybody has the potential to become a fully awakened being. Everybody has the potential to know the nature of reality, to develop impartial love and compassion for every living being. Everybody has the potential to subdue their own anger and greed, without suppressing it, but really work internally to get rid of these undesirable traits. So we try and hold human beings as really valuable and not judge the human being, and instead look at the action and say the action is damaging, the action is harmful. And with that kind of outlook as an activist, then you can establish good human relationships with those people who have different views than you do. If you categorize people into groups, then it's very difficult to communicate on a human level. And I think it's that human connection that's important, to be able to talk to somebody who, is really holding on to their Second Amendment rights, and listen to them from the heart without judging them. Yeah. And to really listen and be curious about, how is this person thinking? What is leading them to their actions and their values? I remember that reading that one of the young men from Parkland, when the students were going around, was it last summer, talking about gun violence in many places. And at the end of the tour, he kind of said, oh, I learned some things, and I have to kind of backtrack and learn to listen to people who have other ideas. So I think that's incredibly important. And it's all based on genuine human respect for everybody across the board, no matter what their beliefs or skin color or whatever. And so to be able to listen and establish human connection with them. Also, I think a faith-based or spiritual religious practice is essential for activism, because otherwise you're going to get discouraged, because especially when you're young, you want to go out there and you're going to change the world, and it's going to happen by next Tuesday, next Wednesday at the latest, but not past that. And then when it doesn't happen, then you go, oh, you know, this is useful. I'm trying so hard. Nobody appreciates what I'm doing. And then you give up. And if you're really going to be an activist, you have to have that long-term perspective. And what gives you that long-term perspective is your spiritual faith, your religious faith, your view of humanity as having potential. You know, your view that people can change, your view that people's hearts and minds at the very basis are pure, and that they're clouded by anger and resentment and greed and manipulation. But that these kinds of mental afflictions are something that we can abandon. They aren't in our nature. And I think that view is so important to be able to continue long term in your work to make a difference. Yeah. So that's one thing that I wanted to make sure to get in here.
And I'll just say, you know, the greatest obstacle, at least in the American context, to common sense, either gun regulation and or the scaling up of some of these strategies, we know to be folks who are either very religiously conservative Christians and or folks who just don't have a deep love and care for the large numbers of death of Black and brown young people, enough to radically shift the way we respond to this violence. So I will just say several things that has worked for us. We attempt to again find the common ground in our texts to help us get to a place of shared at least values and language, and then try to tease out the places of disagreement or dissonance over time. We try to use more stories than we do facts and figures, knowing that stories connect people across difference. And we also seek to approach this from a very intersectional perspective, which just means that what does it mean to tie these issues to other issues of injustice that demonstrate that we have a shared collective humanity that requires our greatest and highest stewardship. If you're talking with an evangelical, I would suggest to, you know, invite them to interrogate the biblical text more than their constitutional rights, quote unquote, and you know, challenge them to excavate and uncover the commands of Jesus that invite us indeed to be peacemakers, to put our swords and weapons away and live into a shared life that is about love and prosperity and hope and not anger, fear, and pain. These and many other things are part of the work we must do. Of course, I invite everyone to take anti-racism courses and become very familiar with the ways in which this country socializes us to have great apathy, if not hatred, towards those who are racialized as the other, and really tap into that so we can indeed, with great care and concern and love, patience and commitment, stop the killings that disproportionately impact our loved ones in Black and brown urban communities across the country. So those are my few thoughts, and take the faiths of people seriously. These faiths often are the meaning-making materials of their lives. Just help them make new meaning.
Well, thank you all so much for joining our webinar. We we'll be sending a copy of both the recording and the slide deck to everyone. The last 2 slides of our PowerPoint has various resources for the intersections between faith and gun violence. It also includes the websites for the Venerable Children and Pastor McBride, as well as like the organizations that they work in. So feel free to check that out. There's also a couple of like documentaries in here, which are actually like, kind of fun to watch, not just me saying that. But yeah, thank you again so much for joining.